A flight attendant was harassing passengers row by row until he reached a K-9 officer's son. That's when his own actions became evidence that silenced the entire crew. He went aisle to aisle, choking passengers like no one could stop him, until he grabbed the child of a trained K-9 officer. Subscribe if you believe justice always bites back harder than abuse. The sound struck first, quick, sharp, like a suitcase wheel cracking against the terminal tile. Darian Ravel's eyes flicked up instantly, not because of the noise itself, but because Rocco had tensed. The retired K-9's frame stiffened beside him, hackles rising ever so slightly, and a low rumble built in the dog's throat like thunder behind a locked door. Kyron, Darian's 7-year-old son, froze with one hand still resting on Rocco's harness. He didn't flinch. He never did when Rocco moved like that. But his fingers tightened, and his small body leaned instinctively into Darian's side. Darian didn't need to be told. Something had just passed by them. The man in question wore the sharp uniform of a flight attendant, pressed navy fabric, polished shoes, an ID badge clipped to his chest with the Virello Air emblem glinting beneath the terminal lights. He was tall, maybe late 30s, rigid in posture. His walk should have been practiced and confident, but Darian saw the stiffness in his steps. The man's jaw was set too tightly, his eyes scanning the crowd too sharply, too fast. And, more importantly, he didn't like the dog. Darian saw that too. The man's nameplate read Merrick Doss. Merrick gave the family a smile, but it was forced, brittle, like a stretched mask barely clinging to the face beneath his eyes, flicked to Rocco, then to Kyron, and something almost imperceptible passed across his expression. A flicker of tension, disapproval, maybe unease. Then he was gone, swallowed by the crowd of travelers winding through the Alderaan Sky Pier terminal. Darian's hand drifted down to Rocco's head, giving a silent scratch behind the ears. "Easy, boy," he muttered. "Noted." Kieran looked up. "Why'd Rocco growl, Dad?" Darian's voice was calm. "Sometimes dogs notice what people miss." The terminal buzzed around them, announcements echoing from overhead speakers, the rolling clatter of luggage wheels, boarding calls bouncing between digital signs. But Darian wasn't hearing any of it anymore. He had seen enough in his years as a K-9 officer to recognize tension that wasn't just nerves. That flight attendant hadn't looked scared. He looked controlled too tightly, like someone rehearsing calm instead of feeling it. As the boarding call for Virello Air Flight 217 came over the speakers, Darian tapped Kieran's shoulder. "Let's move." Kieran adjusted his small backpack, still gripping Rocco's harness, and followed his father toward Gate 6B. Rocco stayed in flawless heel position, silent and alert. The jet bridge smelled of warm metal and recirculated air. Kyron wrinkled his nose but didn't complain. He never did when Rocco was nearby. Darian let the boy walk just ahead, Rocco between them, the old service dog scanning every motion with the quiet focus of muscle memory. Even in retirement, Rocco had a presence that made people pause. Other passengers shifted politely as they passed. Inside the aircraft, Flight 217 hummed with polite chaos, people jostling for overhead bin space, flight attendants reciting safety reassurances, a few children fussing over toy bags. Darian clocked everything in a glance. It wasn't instinct, it was habit, ingrained after years of working threat profiles. He guided Kieran to row 9, helping him into the window seat while Rocco curled at the boy's feet without needing a command. That was when Darian saw him again. Merrick Doss was moving through the aisle with a clipboard in hand, adjusting luggage bins, but not like someone checking safety compliance. His fingers trembled slightly at the corners, the clipboard held just a bit too tightly. He leaned to speak with another flight attendant, a younger man with a hesitant expression who nodded without speaking. The moment passed, but Darian caught it. Doss wasn't calm. He was rehearsed. The unease grew deeper when Merrick paused midway down the aisle, his gaze falling on a crying toddler in row 6. The child wasn't loud, just fussing in that soft, tired way kids do before takeoff. Still, Merrick froze, his jaw set, his eyes hardened. Darian didn't like it. He adjusted his position in the aisle seat, angling himself subtly so he could watch Merrick without appearing to. Rocco, already sensing the shift in energy, kept his ears forward, nose twitching. His body remained calm, but his posture spoke volumes. He was tracking the flight attendant now. The other passengers barely noticed. To them, Merrick was just a serious man doing his job, but to Darian and to Rocco, something darker threaded through the man's actions. Merrick walked past them once, then again, each time slower, his eyes lingering longer on Chiron. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. Darian leaned back in his seat, his voice low as he placed a hand on Rocco's neck. "Watch him!" The dog didn't move, but Darian felt the tension in the harness tighten ever so slightly, a quiet acknowledgement between handler and partner. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as final checks began. Passengers buckled in, flight attendants took their positions, and engines began to hum with mounting force. Chiron shifted in his seat, eyes half-lidded. "Will we be home in time for the bonfire?" Darian nodded. "That's the plan, buddy." But the plan had just encountered a variable one wrapped in a uniform, carrying a clipboard and staring too long at children with unreadable intent. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and the safety briefing began, Darian kept his body relaxed, but his mind razor-sharp. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. The smallest things, posture, tone, silence, told stories most people couldn't hear, and Merrick Doss was a story waiting to snap. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Rocco's ears remained pinned forward, focused on the front of the cabin like a radar locked on target. The seatbelt sign chimed. Darian rested his hand gently on Kieran's shoulder. A single sentence pressed itself into his thoughts with quiet certainty, one he didn't voice aloud but would later remember with striking clarity. Rocco sensed a danger no one else had the training to detect. The jolt came just minutes after takeoff. It wasn't sharp, but enough to make a few passengers laugh nervously and reach for their armrests. Overhead, bins rattled, seatbelts groaned. A toddler near row 6 let out a startled yelp before quieting again in his mother's arms. Flight attendant Merrick Doss, who had previously seemed tense but quiet, suddenly stiffened at the slight turbulence. His face tightened, not in fear, but in an unnatural stillness, like someone forcing their mind into an order that kept slipping through their fingers. Then, without warning, Merrick pivoted and began moving down the aisle. His steps weren't smooth. They had an unsettling jerk to them, as though his body was catching up to decisions his brain hadn't fully made. He stopped in row 2 and addressed the seated passengers in a clipped tone. "Remain calm. I'll be ensuring everyone is appropriately stabilized." No smile, no warmth. Just a flat delivery of words that should have sounded routine, but somehow didn't. The passengers exchanged awkward glances. One man chuckled under his breath, assuming it was just a stern flight attendant taking his job a bit too seriously. Darian Ravel, seated in row 9 with his son Kieran and retired K9 Rocco, didn't laugh. He watched Merrick with quiet precision. There was something disturbingly methodical in the man's movement, something Darian had seen before, not on planes, but in unstable field operators trying to hold themselves together through rehearsed routines. Rocco's ears twitched. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in the space between Darian's boots. Merrick continued to row 3. He placed his hand firmly on a passenger's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. At first, the gesture could have been interpreted as comforting, until the man winced and tried to pull away. Merrick didn't let go. "I need verbal compliance," he said coolly. "Say you are calm." The passenger blinked, stunned. "I'm calm?" Merrick immediately removed his hand and moved on, as though checking off a list. Darian's eyes narrowed. That wasn't protocol. That wasn't any version of customer service. It was a control test. Row by row, Merrick advanced. In row 4, a nervous young man looked up with a hesitant smile. Merrick leaned in without asking and placed both hands around the boy's collarbone area, an area dangerously close to the neck. The boy jerked back. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice cracking. Merrick didn't budge. "Monitoring your breathing." The young man pushed his hands away. Merrick straightened and nodded stiffly, ignoring the rising unease. A couple seated nearby gave each other concerned looks, but said nothing. Kieran leaned against Darian's arm, unaware of the specifics but sensing the weight in his father's silence. The boy's small hand clung tighter to Rocco's harness. Rocco, always disciplined, rose slightly from his down position, his body stretching into alertness. His head turned with Merrick's movements, hackles bristling. Merrick turned and looked directly at Kieran. His gaze lingered too long, too still. Not a curious glance, an assessment. Darian's hand subtly moved to the dog's lead, tightening it just slightly. He didn't rise from his seat yet, but his entire body leaned into readiness. Rocco let out another quiet, guttural sound, not aggressive, protective. A vibration that no one else in the row seemed to notice, but it echoed in Darian's chest like a drumbeat. Merrick turned away and approached the next passenger. This time, he placed his hand under a man's jaw, lifting it slightly. "Assessing airway tension," he said flatly. The passenger flinched. "I'm fine. Don't touch me." Merrick nodded and stepped back, but his face twitched. A small, involuntary movement in his left cheek, a crack in the mask. His fingers flexed. His lips tightened into a smile that didn't belong. Darian knew the signs. He had seen men fall apart under pressure before, men who repeated phrases like lifelines. Men who used rules to mask instability. Merrick was not trying to help passengers, he was trying to control them, and the controls were slipping. The passengers, still unaware of the true threat, whispered now. Uneasy but unsure of their rights, of their options, of whether they were imagining the pattern unfolding in front of them. After all, the man wore a uniform. He must know what he was doing. Only Darian saw the truth. Merrick was spiraling. And whatever came next would not be a misunderstanding. It would be something they could never take back. He studied the aisle, measuring Merrick's distance. Darian had sat near the back intentionally to keep his son close to the lavatories and away from crowds. Now that placement gave him a full corridor view of Merrick's descent. The lights flickered again. Just briefly. The kind of flicker that makes people laugh to cover discomfort. Darian didn't laugh. Neither did Rocco. "Dad," Kieran whispered, "that man's hurting people." Darian didn't look down. His voice was steady. "I see him." The line had not been crossed yet, but it would be. Darian could feel it building. Merrick was following a script, but one that no airline would ever endorse. His motions were rehearsed, his tone robotic, his presence invasive. And now, row by row, he was getting closer. In row 5, Merrick adjusted his tie slowly, as if gearing up for something. He passed by a flight attendant jump seat without noticing the other attendant inside, a younger man watching nervously. Frozen with indecision, he didn't move to stop him. Merrick advanced to row 6, then 7, now 8. Darian's hand tightened around Rocco's lead again. Rocco shifted his stance, paws braced lightly against the floor, shoulder muscles coiled like a spring. The corridor of seats had transformed into a corridor of fear. Darian wasn't sure who Merrick would touch next, but he was certain of one thing. The next step would decide everything. The danger was closing in like a dimming corridor, one row at a time. Merrick stepped into row 5 and, without warning, pressed his thumb against a middle-aged man's throat. The man sputtered in surprise, coughing as he grabbed Merrick's wrist to push it away. "Sir, what are you doing?" the man gasped. Merrick didn't retreat. He leaned in, his voice low and intimate. Whatever he whispered, no one else could hear, but it made the man freeze, eyes wide. A nervous laugh came from the opposite seat, as if trying to smooth over the awkwardness, but the tension stuck to the cabin air like static. Darian noticed the moment. He rose halfway from his seat, pretending to adjust Kieran's shoulder strap, but his eyes were locked on Merrick. The positioning of the hand, the direction of weight, the angle of lean. It was textbook pre-assault behavior dressed in the flimsy cloth of authority. He knew these patterns. He'd taught others how to stop them before they unfolded. Rocco, silent as a ghost, had already moved into the aisle. Not far, just enough to place his body diagonally between Kieran and the corridor. His ears were forward, his chest lifted in breath readiness, and his eyes tracked Merrick's every twitch. Merrick moved on. Row 6. Another passenger. This time, a young man in his 20s reading a paperback. Without a word, Merrick pressed his fingers into the man's collarbone, slowly increasing pressure. The man winced and pulled back. "Is this part of flight safety?" he asked, bewildered. Merrick didn't answer. His face was calm, distant, like he wasn't entirely present. His lips moved again, a soft murmur. The man blinked, visibly uncomfortable. Darian sat back, slowly unbuckling his seatbelt. Not fast enough to draw attention, just enough to prepare. A teenager in the window seat across the aisle made a small, panicked noise as Merrick reached across and pinched both sides of his throat. The teen's hands flew up in defense. "Stop," he wheezed. "Breathe evenly," Merrick said calmly, not moving his hands. "We're stabilizing." "Get away from me," the teen barked, shrinking toward the wall. A man in the adjacent seat opened his mouth to object, but the intensity in Merrick's eyes froze him. Merrick finally pulled back with mechanical grace, standing upright and adjusting his tie with one slow, drawn-out tug. Whispers spread now. Murmurs. Concern. The tension was no longer silent, it had a pulse. Rocco's body lowered slightly, his shoulders squaring. His training was fully activated now, reading every sign from Darian's body language. He didn't growl, didn't bark, he just existed as an alert barrier. Kieran looked up at his father, his voice a soft tremor. "Dad, he's hurting people." Darian's hand found his son's and squeezed gently, never breaking eye contact with the aisle. "I see him," he whispered back, calm and measured. Merrick turned toward row 7. His eyes were darker now. His steps carried a strange weight, like he was moving through water. He bent down toward a man reading from a tablet and began to raise his arm again, but this time the man recoiled instantly. "Don't touch me," the passenger snapped. Merrick blinked as if confused by the rejection. He turned without reacting, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small notepad, pretending to jot something down. No one believed the act. Kieran's breath caught. Darian shifted forward again, posture stilled, mind calculating. Every inch between Merrick and his son became an equation. Angle of attack, time to intercept, Rocco's launching arc. His muscles tensed, not in fear, but in readiness, in control. And then Merrick took the next step. Row 8. Darian's seat was next. Merrick paused in the aisle, his back to Darian. He adjusted his collar, then his belt, like a man preparing for an interview or a speech, every movement deliberate. Every breath rehearsed. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. A baby, somewhere in the back, whimpered. The entire cabin had grown still. Rocco crouched fully now, front paws bracing, body low like a compressed spring. Gaze fixed forward with the intensity of a sniper's scope, Merrick's right hand flexed. He turned slowly, facing row 9, where Darian, Kieran, and Rocco waited. One step forward, then 2. Darian's hands moved with purpose, one on Rocco's harness, the other resting on Kieran's shoulder, securing him to the seat, grounding him with quiet strength. Merrick adjusted his tie one final time. His hand twitched near his pocket, then moved outward, toward Kieran. The world narrowed. Every breath in the cabin froze in place. Darian's eyes sharpened into focus, every nerve alert, every instinct braced. He didn't need to speak to Rocco. The dog's body was already aligning, every muscle ready to intercept. Merrick took another step forward. He raised his hand toward Kieran's neck, and Darian shifted his stance, weight over his toes, ready. The cabin had become a corridor of fear, and the next step would decide everything. Merrick Doss stepped into row 8 with a mechanical grace, eyes vacant and shoulders squared like a man following silent instructions no one else could hear. Without warning, he bent down and placed both hands around the neck of the elderly man seated by the window, pressing his fingers into the hollow below the jawline with calculated force. "I'm clearing an airway obstruction," he muttered flatly, as if reciting from a protocol card. The old man's eyes flared open in shock, mouth parting in a silent gasp. He clawed at Merrick's wrists, weakly, more from disbelief than strength. Passengers nearby jolted upright. A few stood halfway, frozen between protest and confusion. One man reached out as if to help, but stopped when Merrick snapped at them in a raised robotic tone. "Remain seated for security protocol compliance." The cabin fell into a hush that wasn't peace. It was tension, compressed and waiting to ignite. The overhead lights hummed faintly above, but all eyes now tracked Merrick's every twitch. From row 9, Darian Ravel stood slowly, deliberately. His movements were steady, trained. One hand stayed on his son, Kieran's shoulder, the other wrapped around the harness of Rocco, the retired K-9 beside them. Rocco's posture shifted, eyes pinned on Merrick. The growl rumbling from his chest was no longer cautious, it was warning. Merrick released the old man as if shedding an inconvenience and stood upright, surveying the cabin with unsettling calm. His gaze landed on Darian, and held. For a moment, time narrowed to the aisle between them. The hush was no longer just silence, it was the breath before a storm. Merrick took a step forward, his voice now hushed and eerie, the kind of tone used by someone practicing control over something he could barely contain. "For the safety of the cabin," he said, eyes flicking toward Kieran, "I must assess the child next." Darian stepped fully into the aisle. His voice didn't rise, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "You won't touch him." Merrick halted. His face twitched once, then again. Something flickered behind his expression. Not confusion, not fear. Something hollow, like the lights were on inside but no one had been home for quite some time. He tilted his head slowly, as if trying to understand the barrier now in front of him. "I'm following order restoration steps," Merrick said, the words disjointed, as if yanked from a corrupted training manual. "Children require airway compliance clearance in Phase 3. The cadence of the sentence struck Darian like a fingerprint that wasn't casual phrasing. It was scripted. Something was off, terribly off. He loosened Rocco's lead ever so slightly. Not enough to release, just enough to prepare. Behind him, Kieran sat still, clutching the seat's armrest, eyes wide. Rocco lowered into a spring-loaded stance, hind legs tensed, teeth just visible beneath his muzzle. The sound he emitted wasn't barking. It was breath slowed to focus, a trained predator awaiting permission. Merrick's hand rose slowly, hovering just above waist level, drifting toward the boy like a testing wire in search of current. "Step back now," Darian warned, voice rising just enough for passengers nearby to hear. But Merrick didn't step back. He lunged. It wasn't a stagger or a stumble. It was a deliberate, jarring thrust forward, arm outstretched as his fingers closed around the collar of Kieran's shirt and yanked with the force of a man no longer aware of boundaries. Kieran gasped, half choked, instinctively turning toward his father. In the same breath, Rocco launched. The blur of motion was both brutal and precise, a mid-air arc aimed directly at Merrick's extended forearm. The sound of the impact, a thud followed by the scraping collapse of two bodies into the aisle, split the cabin silence like a whip crack. Merrick screamed, more in shock than pain, as Rocco's jaws clamped down not with the intent to shred, but to control. The force sent Merrick stumbling backward, pinned beneath 100 pounds of trained muscle and methodical instinct. Passengers shrieked, some ducked. Others fumbled for their phones. One man shouted for the captain. Another reached to help, only to be held back by Darian's firm voice. "Stay clear. He's under control." Darian pulled Kieran into his chest, shielding the boy with his body while moving just far enough aside to give Rocco full clearance to do what he was bred and built for. The aisle now belonged to the dog. Merrick flailed beneath Rocco's weight, his free hand swinging wildly toward Kieran again. Rocco shifted instantly, releasing the forearm only to pivot, jaws landing at the base of the windpipe. Pressure applied with terrifying accuracy, Merrick froze. His mouth opened. No words came out. His eyes bulged, not in fear, but disbelief. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He wasn't hurt, just held controlled. Shut down. Passengers were no longer unsure. The truth had snapped into focus like lightning illuminating a storm. The danger was not the barking dog or the father who stood guard, but the uniformed man who'd been walking row by row like a ticking fuse. Darian knelt beside the restrained attendant, pulling the belt from his own waist and wrapping it expertly around Merrick's wrists, securing them behind his back. His movements were practiced, quiet, clean. Rocco never shifted pressure, just watched. Merrick wheezed through his teeth, whispering again, "Phase 3, airway, stable." But nobody was listening to him anymore. All eyes were on the boy who had been attacked, the father who never blinked, and the dog whose discipline had become the only law that mattered at 30,000 feet. And as the chaos slowly settled into silence again, one truth remained suspended in the cabin like smoke after fire. The moment Merrick's fingers touched the boy's neck, the entire cabin crossed a line it could never return from. Merrick's fingers clamped down on the fabric of Kieran's collar. In the next breath, Rocco launched. The retired K-9 burst from his crouched stance like a silent missile, his body coiled with precision, aimed not to maul, but to intercept. His trajectory cut through the narrow aisle with uncanny grace, a blur of muscle, discipline, and urgency. In midair, he twisted slightly, jaws snapping open just wide enough to lock onto Merrick's forearm. The impact was clean and decisive, sending the flight attendant stumbling backward into the aisle, a guttural shout escaping his throat as he hit the ground. Screams erupted from row 7 and beyond. Passengers ducked, some shielding loved ones, others scrambling up and pressing against the fuselage walls, unsure whether they were witnessing an attack or a rescue. Tray tables snapped upward, drinks spilled, and gasps rippled like aftershocks through the pressurized cabin. Darian moved instantly. One arm secured Kieran to his chest, the other grabbed the edge of the seat back to stabilize them both. His eyes never left Rocco. "Brace," Darian commanded. At the word, Rocco pivoted, shifting his weight so that Merrick's flailing arm bent inward. The dog's hind legs touched down just enough to anchor his frame. Merrick thrashed, trying to wrench free, but Rocco responded with calculated movements, rebalancing with mechanical grace. Each shift meant not to punish, but to restrain. Merrick's mouth foamed slightly as he shouted hoarsely, "I was performing safety checks. I had authority. You're interfering with order." His voice cracked on the last word. Manic and brittle Darian's jaw tightened as he released Kieran, setting the boy behind him. "Stay there," he whispered. "Don't move. He won't get near you again." Kieran nodded, wide-eyed, arms still wrapped around his backpack like a life vest. Merrick rolled onto his side, attempting to drag himself forward with his free hand, reaching again toward Kieran. "No," Darian growled under his breath. Rocco shifted. In one controlled motion, the K-9's mouth released and relatched higher, just under the curve of Merrick's jawline, at the muscular shelf where voice meets breath. The pressure was firm, not crushing, but unmistakably final. Merrick froze mid-reach, his eyes going wide, pupils dilating. No more movement, Darian said, kneeling beside him. The aisle was now a frozen corridor of silence, the passengers collectively holding their breath. Rocco's teeth remained poised, not to damage but to warn. His low growl, barely audible beneath the aircraft's hum, pulsed like a motor of command. Every twitch Merrick attempted was matched with a microscopic adjustment from the dog A-shift. A flex, a reminder. From behind row 6, someone whispered, "He was hurting the kid." A man in row 5 slowly raised his phone, shaking as he recorded. The screen glowed pale blue in the dim cabin lighting, capturing the frame of the flight attendant on the floor, held immobile not by rage, but by discipline. Darian didn't waste time. With one swift motion he unbuckled his belt, looped it over Merrick's wrists, and pulled tight. The man whimpered, trembling beneath Rocco's chest. The dog didn't flinch, didn't loosen, didn't blink. Merrick's voice returned in a rasp. "I was stabilizing the cabin." "You were choking passengers one by one," Darian said coldly, "and then you reached for my son." More gasps came from behind them. Several passengers began murmuring their own stories, how Merrick had pressed too hard into their throats, how he whispered about compliance and airway alignment. The absurdity of it all began to dissolve, replaced by understanding. Merrick hadn't been assessing anything. He'd been escalating, testing, gripping, controlling, and the last row he reached had been one too far. Kieran peeked around his father's side, trembling slightly. Rocco's tail thumped once against the floor in a protective rhythm. "It's okay now," Darian whispered over his shoulder, eyes still locked on Merrick. "He won't touch you again." The man on the floor blinked rapidly, face flushed with confusion and fading arrogance. "I was performing safety checks." A nearby passenger muttered, "That's not what safety looks like." Merrick tried to turn his head to respond, but the subtle tension in Rocco's jaw stopped him flat. It wasn't pain, it was precision. Passengers stared in awe, not at the violence, but at the restraint. The perfect choreography of a retired K-9 who never once lost control, who never lashed out, who waited for permission, who acted only when the line was crossed. Darian's voice softened, addressing no one in particular. He was trained for this to protect children in transit, to assess threats and stop them. From somewhere behind them, the ping of a phone rang out. Someone had sent the video to a live news stream. The aircraft hadn't hit turbulence, but the shift in the cabin felt seismic. A man in row 4 leaned forward and said it aloud, the truth now too clear to miss. "That dog saved everyone on this plane." Rocco didn't look up. He stayed exactly where he was, ears tuned only to Darian's breath and Merrick's pulse. Darian's hand hovered above the dog's back, not to stop him, but to steady him, to say without words, "We're not done yet." Merrick's own windpipe became the quiet evidence of how far he had crossed the line. Merrick writhed beneath the controlled weight of the dog, his breath slicing in and out in erratic, broken gulps. His eyes darted wildly, veins bulging at the edges, stunned not only by the force pinning him, but by the reality that it came from a creature he'd dismissed entirely. Rocco held steady, teeth clamped just under Merrick's chin, not deep enough to puncture, but exact enough to paralyze. Every inch of the dog's body was braced in disciplined tension, front paws angled on either side of Merrick's chest, the deep, rhythmic growl in his throat pulsing like a warning drum. "Stay seated," Darian's voice cut clean through the panic. It wasn't shouted, but there was something immovable about it, something that made people obey. The passengers, still reeling from what they had seen, froze in their seats. Some stood halfway, unsure whether to step forward, help, or scream again. One man in row 5 raised his hand shakily. Do you need help restraining?" "No," Darian said calmly, already crouched beside the struggle. "He's not going anywhere." Rocco didn't flinch. Not even when Merrick's limbs spasmed again in a sudden, desperate twitch. The dog simply adjusted, leaned forward just slightly, his canines brushing against the ridge of Merrick's windpipe. A thin wheeze escaped the flight attendant's throat as his body stiffened in immediate surrender. Darian's eyes narrowed. Merrick wasn't resisting in rage, he was muttering. Mandatory. Airway check. Confirm sequence. Stabilize tension. Authority granted. Each phrase slipped from his lips with the memorized cadence of a man reciting lines from a broken record. It wasn't speech. It was programming. Darian's gaze swept over him, picking up the details with the precision of a trained handler. The sweat on Merrick's brow wasn't from exertion alone. It was cold, the kind of sweat that came with fear or extreme mental overload. His pupils were blown wide, unreactive. His jaw was locked, his skin pale. It was the face of a man trying to convince himself that the world he was acting in still followed the rules he remembered. Darian reached out, gently pulling at the edge of Merrick's crew badge. It was torn slightly during the struggle, bent out of shape. As he peeled back the frayed top laminate, something caught his eye. A second layer. It wasn't supposed to be there. Beneath the standard ID was another segment, barely visible but enough to show a faint barcode and initials. SH. Darian paused, memorizing the placement. He didn't lift it further, not yet. He needed witnesses. He needed this preserved. From the galley, a soft shuffle echoed. The second attendant, a thin, nervous man with pale skin and sunken eyes, stepped out cautiously, wringing his hands. His name tag read, Jaron Tall. I didn't know what to do, he said quietly, eyes darting toward Merrick. He wasn't like this before. Darian didn't look away from the pinned man. When did he change? Jaron swallowed. This month, after a meeting he wouldn't talk about. I never saw him the same again. Darian stood slowly. Call the captain. Tell him the threat's restrained, but the situation isn't over. Jaron nodded and disappeared again down the narrow corridor. Kieran's small hand tugged at Darian's sleeve. Is Rocco okay? The boy asked softly, eyes glued to the motionless tableau. He's perfect, Darian said, crouching down to touch his son's shoulder. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do. Kieran reached down, gently patting Rocco's flank. The dog's eyes flicked to the boy, acknowledging, alert, but he didn't move. His entire body was coiled over Merrick like a fuse wired to discipline. From the seats, murmurs began again. Is he crazy? Was he going to hurt the kid? Why didn't anyone stop him sooner? A man stood, eyes wide. He said something to me. Something about passenger resistance being grounds for physical intervention. What kind of policy is that? Darian stood slowly, facing the cabin. There is no policy like that. Not in any airline I've known. A ripple of realization passed through the passengers. The illusion had cracked. The authority Merrick claimed wasn't real. Suddenly, Merrick twisted again, a violent jerk of his torso. Rocco reacted instantly, pushing forward with his weight and tightening his grip, not enough to break skin, but enough to stop every muscle in Merrick's body like a snapped circuit. His back arched, then slammed flat against the cabin floor, breath hissing out in a helpless rasp. Darian didn't flinch. The message was clear. Merrick learned the hard truth. A K-9's control is built on discipline, not anger. The cockpit door cracked open with a sharp hiss of air pressure, just wide enough for a pair of eyes to emerge, alert, narrowed, searching. Captain Renlock Varen leaned out with stiff posture, his left hand braced on the doorframe and his right clenched around the edge of the intercom. His voice didn't waver, but the low baritone hinted at rising urgency. "Sir," he said, locking eyes with Darian Ravel across the cabin. "Status report." Darian didn't hesitate. He attempted airway assaults on multiple passengers. Rocco stopped him. Cabin secure for now. His voice carried authority, not loud, not panicked, just controlled. the kind of voice that steadied everyone within earshot. Renlock's brow furrowed as his gaze flicked to the pinned flight attendant sprawled across the aisle. Merrick Doss was breathing in erratic bursts, eyes wide and unfocused, mouth moving as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. The captain absorbed the sight quickly, nodded once, and withdrew into the cockpit. The door sealed with a dull thump. The soft hum of engines filled the silence that followed, underscoring every anxious breath in the cabin. Rocco stood like a sentry, half straddling Merrick's chest, keeping weight strategically across the upper torso while his muzzle hovered just inches from the man's throat. A growl no longer rumbled, but tension coiled in every line of the dog's body like a taut wire. Merrick began to mumble again. Maintain, order, secure sequence, airway, compliance. His voice cracked with each word, breaking rhythm like a skipping tape recorder. The phrases didn't sound like sentences, more like fragments. Memorized routines, training instructions, maybe. But there was no emotion behind them, only automation. As if his mind was clinging to whatever programming it had been fed, no longer tethered to actual reality. Darien knelt slowly beside the scene, his knees pressing gently into the carpet between scattered safety cards and crumpled boarding passes. "Merrick," he said firmly, watching the man's pupils, "look at me." No response. The muttering continued, now quieter. Merrick's hands twitched under Rocco's weight, fingers flexing with strange stiffness, not trying to escape, just moving, like signals firing from a broken circuit. Darien tilted his head slightly, studying the rhythm of the words. "These aren't yours," he muttered to himself. "Someone put them there." Kieran sat nearby, silent but alert, his small hands clenched tightly around the base of Rocco's harness. His face was pale, eyes wide but dry. The boy was scared, but grounded, as if taking cues from the two calmest beings he knew. His father and his dog, Darien, slid a protective arm around his son, feeling the boy lean into him with unspoken trust. A sudden jolt of turbulence rippled through the plane. Overhead bins rattled. Gasps echoed down the cabin. A drink cup tumbled from a tray. But Darien didn't flinch. His grip on Kieran held steady, his other hand resting just beside Rocco's flank, not restraining, not directing, just anchoring. The cockpit light above the door blinked twice. Then came the sound of soft footsteps approaching. The return of the second flight attendant, Jaron Tull, moved down the aisle like a ghost, his face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. He stopped short when he reached row 9 and crouched slightly. I have to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling. Darien met his gaze. "Speak." "There were warnings filed about him," Jaron whispered, "about Merrick. I saw them, more than once, but they disappeared, from the system, like they were never there." A chill settled in Darien's chest, but he didn't show it. "When did they vanish?" "Last month," Jaron replied, swallowing hard. "Then again, last week. I didn't say anything. I didn't think they'd—" He stopped, guilt choking the rest. Darien exhaled slowly, gaze narrowing on Merrick. "Someone's been covering for him." Jaron nodded miserably. "I can try to pull the last activity log before we land. It's buried in the flight system terminal near the galley." "Do it," Darien said. "Quietly. Any deletions, timestamps, alternate crew IDs, I want it all." Jaron blinked, surprised at the clarity of the command, but nodded and moved quickly. Back on the floor, Merrick twitched again. Row by row. Stabilize. Prevent disruption. His voice was louder now, the cadence chilling, a phrase clearly repeated so often it had etched itself into the muscle memory of his mouth. He wasn't improvising, he was reciting, like a man following a broken script. Darien's gut hardened. He looked to Rocco, who was still holding firm but adjusted slightly, rebalancing weight as Merrick tried to flex his shoulders. It wasn't a threat. Not yet. But Darien knew better than to underestimate a cornered man who believed his madness was a mission. Chiron's whisper broke the silence. "Dad, is he sick?" Darien glanced at his son. "Yes," he said softly, "but someone let it happen." From a few rows back, a passenger called out, "Is everything safe now?" Another followed, "Is someone flying the plane?" Nervous laughter tried to rise, but it couldn't push past the weight in the cabin. Darien turned toward them. "Captain is in control. This man's been restrained. No one's in danger." His voice had the kind of calm that didn't invite argument. It gave people something to believe in. Still, tension hung in the air like static. Merrick moaned again. "Compliance? Airway inspection. Per protocol. Per protocol." Darien reached for the badge clipped to Merrick's collar, noticing the edges. Frayed. Partially torn. Just beneath it, barely visible, was a second, hidden layer of laminate. Something fused beneath the surface. He didn't touch it yet. Just studied it. Memorized its shape. Whatever Merrick was doing on this flight, whatever programming he believed he was following, it hadn't come from standard airline training, and someone wanted that fact buried before this plane even touched the ground. As passengers whispered among themselves, more than one turned their gaze to Darien and the dog beside him. The image said everything. A father shielding his child, a dog standing guard over truth, and a man unraveling in the center of it all. Rocco didn't move. He didn't bark. He didn't bite. He just remained. And in doing so, he became something greater than just a protector. He became the quiet wall between panic and order, the presence that passengers now trusted more than any uniform or badge on that plane. Rocco remained the silent barrier between chaos and the boy who trusted him. The cabin lurched slightly as the first jolt of descent hit the undercarriage. Oxygen masks didn't drop, but the low rumble of the engines shifting into landing mode gave everyone a collective shiver. Darien didn't flinch. He kept one knee grounded beside Merrick's pinned body, his hand steady on Rocco's harness, eyes flicking to each row with methodical calm. Passengers clutched armrests, whispered into phones, or held loved ones tightly. But the center of gravity in that cabin wasn't the cockpit. It was the aisle. More specifically, the spot where a disciplined K-9 held down a man who had become a walking hazard in uniform. A man in row 5 broke the silence first, his voice dry and shaky. He pressed here. He touched his own throat with trembling fingers. "Right here." Said he was checking breathing. I couldn't breathe. Another man, older and wearing a Varello-branded travel jacket, added in a hoarse voice, "He said, 'Airway compliance is mandatory,' before he grabbed my jaw. Like it was a script." Darien's jaw tightened. That was it. It wasn't random aggression, it was patterned, rehearsed, scripted. He turned his head slightly toward Kieran, who had nestled close beside him with one arm around Rocco's back, small fingers buried in fur. "Dad," Kieran whispered, eyes wide. Why was he doing that? Darien's voice was soft but steady. Because someone let him break rules without stopping him. Rocco shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the pressure on Merrick's chest without drawing blood, just as he had been trained. Merrick's eyes darted, blinking hard as if struggling to stay anchored in the present. His lips moved again, the sound barely audible. Row, row by row. Compliance, secure, sequence. Jaron Tull emerged from the crew storage hatch, breath ragged, clutching a crew-issued tablet. His hands shook as he held it out to Darien, like a man offering an artifact that might detonate. "These were deleted," he said under his breath. I found logs. From the past 6 months, passenger complaints, aggression, hands-on contact. All of them marked resolved. But look." He tapped rapidly until a series of reports appeared on the cracked screen. Each ended with the same supervisor clearance code, SH01X. The name field was blank. Darian's breath left him like a quiet exhale of ice. The hidden badge layer, the clipped phrases, the psychological collapse disguised as protocol. It was all tied to a cover-up. Someone had built a false authority around Merrick, one that overrode normal checks and balances. Kieran looked up. "Is that bad?" he asked. Darian nodded once. "It means someone made him think he was doing the right thing." The plane shuddered again as flaps deployed landing gear groaned into position beneath their feet. The airport now loomed below them, Hellion Field. Visible through the narrow oval windows as a patchwork of lights and waiting vehicles, Darian leaned closer to Merrick's face. "Who gave you the sequence?" he asked quietly. Merrick's eyes twitched and his voice cracked as though the words had been stored behind his teeth too long. "I was following the sequence they gave me." The words spread like a chill draft across the rows. Passengers looked at one another, eyes wide. What had begun as confusion was now slipping into terror. This wasn't a man who snapped. This was a man who had been given permission. Darian locked eyes with Jaren. "Record that." Jaren, pale but resolute, lifted the tablet again and began recording audio, making sure the timestamp was clear and intact. Around them, the cabin braced itself, but no one looked toward the cockpit for comfort anymore. Every pair of eyes turned to Darian. In row 4, a middle-aged man turned to the woman beside him. "Forget the crew. I trust him." Darian scanned the aisle. Merrick's breathing had quickened, his pupils still dilated. Rocco never moved except to adjust pressure when Merrick twitched. There was no anger in the dog's movements, only the trained poise of a guardian doing exactly what he was born to do. Jaren sat down beside the nearest jump seat, clutching the tablet like a shield. "We're 20 seconds out. You think they're ready for this?" "No," Darian said, "but they need to be." The intercom buzzed. The captain's voice, tired, anxious, came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing. Please remain seated and calm. Ground security will meet the aircraft." The passengers listened, but their attention stayed fixed on Darian and Rocco. The real control was already here. Kieran leaned in closer to his father. "Will they believe us?" Darian looked at the phone someone was still using to record. The passengers with bruises along their throats, the hidden badge tucked into an evidence pouch in his pocket. Then he met his son's eyes and nodded. "They'll have to." As the wheels screeched against the tarmac and the cabin jolted once more, the plane descended, but the truth inside the cabin was only beginning to rise. He tightened his grip on every victim, laughing as panic spread through the cabin, unaware the next row held the one boy no predator should ever touch. If you believe arrogance breaks the moment truth stands up, hit subscribe now, because justice never travels alone. The wheels slammed against the tarmac with a jolt, jolting passengers upright. Gasps filled the cabin, followed by a brief silence, then the deep roar of the engines shifting into reverse as Varelo Air Flight 217 braked hard down the emergency runway. Outside the narrow oval windows, blue and red lights pulsed across the tarmac like strobe warnings in the dark. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport security vehicles circled, casting long, racing shadows inside the cabin. The intercom buzzed to life. "For your safety, all passengers must remain seated until authorities secure the threat," the captain announced, unaware that the threat was already face down in the aisle, locked beneath the firm weight of a retired K-9 and a father's unwavering command. Rocco stayed low but steady, muzzle near Merrick Doss's throat, his body unmoving except for the subtle tremor of disciplined breath. The flight attendant lay trapped, his limbs quivering, lips muttering fragments of nonsense. Airway. Comply. Restore the order. As if clinging to a vanishing script no one else could see. His uniform was disheveled, badge bent, hair matted with sweat. The cabin door opened with a metallic hiss, and boots pounded up the jet bridge. A team of transit security officers swept in, followed by 2 medical examiners in navy blue vests. They paused mid-stride at the surreal sight. A grown man restrained not by a squad but by a single dog, whose composure sent a clear message. This was no ordinary animal. Sergeant Laren Vosk stepped forward first, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Report," he said simply. Darian didn't rise yet. His voice was calm, measured, but each word landed with weight. Merrick Doss initiated physical assaults on passengers, choked multiple people, reached for my son's throat. Rocco intervened. Threat is neutralized. Vosk blinked once, then glanced down at the dog. Is he still a working unit? Retired, infant defense trained, responded exactly as designed. The sergeant gave a slight nod. Understood, proceed. Merrick jerked suddenly, trying to lift an elbow, but Rocco didn't flinch. He shifted his front paw slightly to apply controlled pressure. A gentle correction backed by years of instinct and obedience. Merrick groaned, breath catching. "I was following instructions," he wheezed. "I had to assess airway disruptions." "Sir," one of the officers called out, "badge is damaged." Another officer knelt beside Merrick, lifting the partially torn ID tag clipped to his collar. As he turned it over, something odd caught the light. A second laminated layer beneath the standard credentials, thin but noticeable. He peeled it back slowly. What emerged was an unauthorized clearance code, one that did not match Virello Air's standard registry. The officer looked up sharply. This wasn't issued by the airline. Gasps rose across the cabin. Some passengers covered their mouths. Others craned their necks to see Jaron Tull, the pale and trembling second flight attendant, stepped forward from the galley where he'd been hiding. He faltered. "I found this in the tablet logs, deleted reports, complaints filed about him. Someone erased them." Vosk straightened. "Show me." Jaron handed over a tablet, fingers shaking. Vosk scrolled. The screen revealed a list of misconduct entries. Excessive physical contact, unapproved passenger handling, verbal threats, each one marked resolved by the same non-standard reviewer tag, SHDL-12. Not a single signature matched any known supervisory personnel. Darian watched all of it without blinking. He didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He just kept his hand lightly on Rocco's back, anchoring the moment in quiet readiness. "Medical team," Vosk ordered, "start passenger assessments. Get photos of all neck bruising and witness statements row by row. Every piece of this is going into the chain." As medical staff fanned out, a young man from row 5 lifted his sleeve to reveal finger marks along his throat. Another middle-aged passenger whispered, "He told me airway compliance was mandatory. I thought it was a drill." Darian shifted slightly to let Kieran slide into his side. The boy curled against his chest, arms wrapped around Rocco's back, eyes wide but dry. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. He was still on duty. Merrick began muttering again. Safety. Sequence. Stabilize. Compliance. Row by row. His voice was barely audible over the growing murmur of passengers and scribbling of pens on notepads. Darian looked down at him once, then at Vosk. "You need to log everything. There's more to this." Vosk didn't need convincing. He gestured for the badge to be sealed in an evidence pouch, snapping it shut with a metallic click. "Sir," a young officer said, gesturing to Merrick, "how do you want us to proceed?" Vosk's eyes swept the cabin once more. People were shaken. Children were clutching parents. Several passengers held up their phones, still recording. He turned back to Darian and said, "Your dog kept this entire cabin safe." Darian met his gaze. His voice was quiet, but resolute. He did what he was trained to do. As Merrick was taken away, the evidence of his windpipe pressure spoke louder than anything he could say. The moment the rear service door clanged shut behind Merrick's restrained frame, a hush fell over the cabin. Not relief, but an exhausted, collective pause, like a room inhaling deeply after nearly suffocating flashing emergency lights from the tarmac sliced across the windows. casting rotating red and blue glows over shaken faces. The echo of seatbelt clicks spread through the cabin as passengers slowly began to rise, unsure whether to exhale or remain frozen in the echo of what had just unfolded. Darian Ravel remained seated in row 9, his hand resting protectively on Kieran's shoulder, while Rocco lay sprawled at their feet like a living wall. Around them, uniformed transit officers moved down the aisle with practiced urgency, stopping at each row to speak with passengers, photograph bruises, and collect hastily recorded phone videos. Every passenger they interviewed told a different version of the same nightmare: hands pressed into necks, whispers of forced compliance, and a flight attendant whose authority had turned into something predatory. Darian watched it all with an unreadable expression. His internal gears hadn't stopped turning since Merrick's hands first reached for his son. He wasn't just processing what happened, he was already analyzing what didn't make sense. Something about Merrick's language, his timing, the vacant cadence in his voice. It wasn't impulsive, it was rehearsed. Sergeant Laren Vosk, the lead officer, returned to Darian with a firm nod and held up a sealed evidence pouch. Inside, the broken remains of Merrick's ID badge glinted beneath the plastic. "There's something else," Vosk said quietly, crouching beside the seat to keep his voice from reaching the others. "The second layer under his badge, his clearance signature, not in the airline system, at all." Darian leaned in, eyes narrowing. "You're sure?" "Positive. The airline security chief scanned it, came back with an error. Whoever approved this wasn't part of Varello Air." Darian's jaw tightened. That wasn't incompetence. That was infiltration. While Vosk rose to question the next row, Jaron Tull was led to the front for formal questioning. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, sweat staining the collar of his uniform. Darian could see it clearly. Fear of what telling the truth might unravel. A few minutes later, when the young attendant returned looking pale, he stopped beside Darian and spoke in a low, shaky voice. "He wasn't supposed to work today," Jaron confessed, his fingers trembling. "His name wasn't on the roster. Someone switched his schedule just this morning." Darian's spine straightened slightly. "You're sure?" I double-checked it's not a system error. Someone overrode the log and reassigned him, then scrubbed the original entry. I only noticed it when I saw his gate assignment didn't match the name on our pre-flight brief." A new kind of dread settled in Darian's gut. Who had clearance to make those kinds of changes? Jaron hesitated. "Only operations supervisors, but I didn't recognize the override code. It wasn't a name, just initials. S.H., maybe?" It flashed for a second before it cleared. Darian's eyes flicked toward the front of the plane. Near the emergency door, a man in a slate-gray blazer hovered without purpose, flight operations by the look of the badge clipped to his chest. His eyes met Darian's for an instant, then quickly darted away. The man turned, stepped back into the jet bridge, and vanished like smoke before Darian could signal Vosk. Rocco lifted his head slightly, ears tilted toward the exit as if he too sensed the sudden withdrawal of something important. Kieran, quiet throughout the interrogation process, leaned into his father, resting one small palm on Rocco's thick neck. The dog didn't move except to lower his head again onto Kieran's foot like a living seatbelt. One of the transit officers knelt nearby. "Your dog? Is he always this calm after a takedown?" Darian replied without looking away from the jet bridge. "He's trained not just to end threats, but to wait for the next one." The officer blinked, unsure if it was meant as a warning or a truth. Another officer approached and asked the same question that had surfaced 3 times already. "Has Rocco ever done civilian defense work before?" Darian finally turned, voice steady. He was part of a specialized K-9 child protection program. Not many knew about it. Quiet deployments, schools, community centers, custody disputes where violence was likely. That answer caught even the officers off guard. Vosk, returning with a clipboard full of signed statements, paused mid-step. "And you brought him on this flight?" "He's retired," Darian replied, "but my son sleeps better when Rocco's with him, and I trust his instincts more than any pre-boarding check." There was a pause. Then one of the bruised passengers from row 5 stepped forward. "He saved all of us." The words came softly, but they silenced the aisle. Meanwhile, a technician walked in with the flight's security backup logs, only to announce that a 3-minute window of data had been corrupted, coinciding precisely with the moment Merrick's schedule had been altered. Darian sat still, absorbing every thread. The badge, the clearance override, the reassigned shift, the shadowy man at the exit. Someone didn't just let Merrick loose. Someone sent him. And whoever it was, they were still hiding within the system's blind spots. As he reached down to unclip Rocco's harness, he whispered under his breath, "Not just rogue, designed." And then, from somewhere near the flight deck, a technician called out that the cabin manifest had just refreshed, with Merrick's profile marked unavailable under emergency access. Erased. Darian didn't blink. The closer the truth came, the faster the shadows tried to slip away. The interview room door clicked shut behind them with a soft finality. No introductions, no delay. Just the sterile silence of a fluorescent-lit chamber inside the Alderwin Transit Investigation Center. Darian Revell sat on the left, upright and focused, his son, Kieran, tucked in beside him, fingers still wrapped tightly around Rocco's harness. The dog lay still, alert but calm, head resting on his forepaws. A wide mirror stretched across one wall, a mirror that everyone in the room knew wasn't a mirror at all. Darian didn't glance at it. He already understood who was behind it, and, more importantly, why. The door opened again. 2 officers entered, both male, clad in navy tactical jackets with clipped badges. The taller one carried a folder thick with passenger statements, photographs, and printed video stills. The other plugged a portable drive into the flat screen, bolted to the wall, and tapped a few keys. "Let's begin," said the lead officer, his voice neither welcoming nor cold, just procedural. On the screen, the first video began playing, a shaky clip from a phone, capturing Merrick Doss as he pressed his thumb into the neck of a man in row 5. The man coughed, face twisting in panic, trying to squirm away as Merrick leaned closer. Gasps echoed faintly in the background of the footage, but no one intervened. The next clip showed Merrick gripping a teenager's jaw between his fingers, muttering something unintelligible. The last one, shakier than the rest, captured Merrick lunging toward Kieran, only to be intercepted midair by a flash of tan muscle, Rocco. The officers didn't pause the videos. They let them roll in full, even the part where Merrick writhed beneath Rocco's weight, pinned with terrifying precision. When the final video ended, the room was silent again, except for Rocco's steady breathing. The door opened once more. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s entered, wearing a charcoal suit with a silver lapel pin. His name tag read, Inspector Corin Vale. He moved like a man who had walked into many rooms like this before, but treated none of them lightly. "Mr. Revell," he said, extending his hand. "I'm grateful you're here." Darian stood briefly, shook it firmly, and sat again. Vale pulled up a chair and opened a thick folder, flipping to a page marked with a yellow tab. "I've reviewed preliminary reports and videos. What I need now is something only you can provide. A technical breakdown of what your K9 did, step by step." Darian nodded, his tone calm and clinical, the way it had been during dozens of debriefings in his former fieldwork days. He launched from a sitting stance at a calculated 45-degree angle. Darian began, his eyes not on the screen but on the space where memory lived, targeted Merrick's right forearm, avoiding bone. Clamped with calibrated pressure, not deep enough to tear but firm enough to halt movement. When Merrick attempted to strike again with his opposite hand, Rocco repositioned, pivoted off his rear legs to bring his weight across the torso. A second clamp landed along the trachea's base. Not a choke, just a freeze point. Vale listened closely, eyes narrowed in respectful concentration. and the final immobilization. Maintained jaw clamp while bracing his hind legs against the floor. Applied just enough pressure to restrict vertical movement, not respiration. If Rocco had wanted to injure, he could have crushed cartilage. He didn't. Vale leaned back slightly, clearly impressed. That's textbook military-level restraint. No, Darian corrected gently. That's trust. Between a handler and a dog who still believes in the job. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Vale reached into his folder again. Merrick's file is incomplete, he said, flipping pages. But what's there shows multiple incidents of erratic conduct, small things, complaints about inappropriate passenger contact. Every report was signed off by someone listed as S. Halricks. Supervisor? Darian asked. Vale shook his head. That's the thing. There is no S. Halricks. No record of them in any staffing database. No login credentials tied to that name. It's a ghost. But this ghost has cleared at least 3 cases, including Merrick's Our Working Theory, is someone created an identity to override psychological evaluations and maintain clearance for compromised staff. Kieran looked up at his father, confused. Sensing the shift, Darian placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but his eyes remained locked on Vale. You're saying Merrick wasn't cleared by accident, Darian said slowly. Someone helped him slip through. Vale nodded. We believe this goes beyond one man's breakdown. It may be part of a forged credential network embedded deep in Virello Air's internal system. What worries me more, he hesitated, then added, is that Merrick didn't create the training script he was quoting. The cadence, the repetition, it's not natural, it's fed. Darian's jaw tightened. He wasn't improvising. He was reciting. Vale leaned forward. You heard it. I did. The rhythm matched the kind of emergency protocol drills we used to run in elite K9 units, except his was twisted, misaligned. He repeated airway compliance, sequence, order, preservation, like it was gospel. Chiron's small voice broke through. He kept saying the same thing, like he wasn't really there. Both men looked at the boy. Vale softened. I've worked cases for 20 years, he said, seen cover-ups, system failures, even sabotage. But never this, never something that feels rehearsed and buried at the same time. Rocco shifted slightly, resting his chin on Kieran's knee. The boy smiled faintly, tension easing from his shoulders. Vale gathered the papers back into the folder and stood. We're launching a full inquiry into the forged credential system. But I'll be honest, if someone created this ghost ID, they'll try to erase the trail. Fast. Darian stood too, calm but firm. Then move faster, because if someone went this far to keep him on board, they might try to bury the truth again. Vale paused at the door, hand resting on the knob, and looked back with quiet understanding. Every answer revealed a larger question waiting beneath it. The footage hit the networks like a rupture in the nation's spine. Clips from Virello Air Flight 217 flooded every major channel and social feed. A flight attendant with deadened eyes choking passengers one by one, and a retired K-9 launching midair to stop him just before he reached a child. Within hours, the media dubbed it the row-by-row assault flight. The cabin became National Ground Zero commentators argued over the footage, trying to explain what the world had just witnessed. But no one could deny the truth etched into the eyes of every shaken passenger. Something had gone terribly wrong above 30,000 feet. Virello Air's public relations team responded with practiced speed, issuing a tight statement by dawn. We regret the isolated actions of one individual who has since been detained. This was an unfortunate deviation from protocol. The airline is cooperating with authorities. But the word isolated didn't hold. By noon, someone had leaked passenger complaints from months prior, some marked escalated, others quietly closed without follow-up. The name Merrick Doss appeared repeatedly. Worse still, internal screenshots began circulating online, showing a clearance override under the strange authorization code S. Halrix. The internet turned from confused to furious. Inside a private hearing room lined with pale acoustic panels, Darian Ravel sat with Kieran beside him, Rocco resting in a downstay near their feet. The child hadn't said much that morning. He held a small stress ball given to him by a transit counselor and occasionally leaned against Rocco's side for comfort. Darian kept a hand resting on his son's shoulder, not just for comfort, but to anchor himself as the storm gathered outside. Inspector Corin Vale stood at the head of the table, his voice steady but lined with urgency. He placed a flat tablet on the desk, tapping it to show high-resolution stills of Merrick's ID badge, particularly the secondary plastic layer fused beneath the official laminate. "This wasn't printed with standard airline equipment," Vale said. "In fact, the printer model used was decommissioned 2 years ago and sold at a liquidation auction." Darian leaned forward slightly. "You think someone outside the airline printed it?" Vale nodded. "Or someone who still had access to old clearance materials. Either way, it wasn't internal, at least not officially." Kieran stirred, mumbling, "Is that why he hurt people?" Darian looked down at his son and met his eyes gently. "That's part of it, but someone let him wear that badge knowing what it meant." Across the room, the screen flashed again. More logs appeared, incident reports flagged by a junior attendant named Jaron Tull, each one noting excessive contact or passenger distress in relation to Merrick. Every report was signed off by S. Halrix. Vale's voice dropped. "We traced that code back. It's not tied to any living employee. In fact, it belongs to a supervisor who hasn't worked for the airline in over 4 years, and technically, he was declared deceased in a boating accident." Darian sat back slowly, the implications unfolding like a fog clearing across dangerous terrain. "So, someone either stole the name, or he didn't die," Darian murmured. "Both possibilities are being explored," Vale replied. "And this isn't the only case. 3 other attendants from Merrick's division had similar override codes attached to misconduct records that were never reviewed." Outside, rain pattered against the windows as if trying to echo the growing tension inside back at home. The weight of the experience began pressing harder on Kieran. He woke up twice that week crying softly, gripping Rocco's fur in the dark. The nightmares were vague, just flashing lights, pressure on his neck, and the moment Merrick's hand had reached for him. Each time, Darian entered quietly, sat beside the bed, and whispered reassurances until the boy's breathing slowed. "He's here," Darian would say, rubbing Rocco's shoulder. "He never stops watching over you." The dog never left Kieran's side at night. He curled along the base of the bed like a wall made of muscle, fur, and memory. Darian knew it wasn't over. Not for Kieran, not for the other passengers, and not for the truth. In the public sphere, debate exploded. "Should trained K-9S be allowed in family travel scenarios?" asked one national host. "Should they be part of passenger protection standards?" Experts chimed in, pointing to Rocco's flawless restraint as a case study in discipline and deterrence airline unions pushed back, citing safety concerns. But momentum grew. Rocco was no longer just a dog. He was a symbol of what proper training, discipline, and foresight could prevent. Darian, watching the coverage from their small living room, remained silent. He didn't like the attention, but he understood its use. He opened his laptop that evening, typing a letter, short, formal, precise, to the National Aviation Oversight Committee. He proposed a new safety protocol: integration of certified K-9 support officers in family boarding lanes and high-risk cabin zones, not aggressive protection, not intimidation, just quiet, trained presence. He called it the Guardian Line. The name came from Kieran himself, who had once described Rocco as the line no bad guy can cross. The next day, Darian and Kieran were called to another closed-door meeting. Inspector Vale looked grim but determined. "We found out who printed the badge," he said, "or rather, where. It was traced back to a private equipment vendor in Caltron. Someone paid cash, no names, but we're working backwards now. Darian asked the only question that mattered. You think Merrick knew what he was doing? Vale exhaled. I think he was unstable, but I also think someone fed him the idea that he was restoring order, that chaos had to be silenced passenger by passenger. Kieran clutched Rocco's neck quietly, eyes wide. Darian nodded once, then rose to leave. The storm had passed, but the damage it revealed went deeper than any flight plan could measure, and in every airport hallway, in every boarding lane where families now looked over their shoulders, Rocco's silent gaze remained a shield that didn't blink. The incident had ended, but the echoes of its truth reached far beyond the runway. The tribunal room was silent when Inspector Corin Vale stood and walked toward the front, holding a single black folder in one gloved hand. No introductions, no preamble, just the weight of the moment pressing down on every seat. We have completed our findings, he began, his voice firm, not dramatic. Behind him, digital displays lit up with diagrams, timelines, and forensic evidence. The badge used by flight attendant Merrick Doss was part of a forged clearance program, traceable to a former mid-tier manager within Virello Air who vanished from the company roster 5 years ago under suspicious circumstances. Murmurs swept through the audience, aviation officials, legal representatives, and members of the press. Darian Ravel, seated 2 rows from the front with his son Kieran and retired K9 Rocco, sat perfectly still. Only his eyes moved, focused, unblinking. His right hand rested protectively on Kieran's shoulder, while Rocco's head remained low but alert by the boy's feet. Vale continued, tapping the screen behind him. The manager in question, name withheld due to pending charges, initiated a rogue digital protocol buried in the airline's credentialing system. This hidden layer allowed employees to bypass both psychological fitness evaluations and safety protocol verifications. Merrick Doss was one of them. He paused. He was not trained to perform passenger airway assessments. There is no such protocol. What he followed was a corrupted script embedded into his schedule under a false authority tag. A heavy silence settled over the room. It was no longer a story about one man breaking down on a flight. It was about a system designed to fail. Wrapped in the illusion of order, Merrick Doss, Vale added, has since been committed to a federal treatment facility. During his sessions, he confirmed he was contacted anonymously and urged to restore order on flights flagged for high passenger agitation. That phrase, high agitation, matches specific digital markers embedded in the airline's staff rotation algorithm. The source of these markers traces back to the same missing manager. Darian felt Kieran shift beside him, small fingers tightening against his forearm. He looked down briefly and offered a calm nod. The boy exhaled. One of the tribunal judges, a gray-suited man named Renler Cadden, leaned forward. "And what does your team recommend in response to these findings, Inspector?" Vale didn't hesitate. Mandatory reconstruction of Virello Air's internal credentialing system. External auditing for no less than 5 years. All cabin staff must undergo independent psychological rotation checks every 6 months, and full transparency regarding supervisory oversight. He looked directly at Darian. "But there's one more recommendation." The lights dimmed slightly as a final screen lit up behind Vale. A looping video played of Rocco, calm, precise, and controlled, intervening as Merrick lunged toward Kieran. The footage showed Rocco bracing midair, pinning the man without injuring him, then shifting his bite with surgical timing to stop a second strike. Gasps and soft acknowledgments filled the room. Vale faced the panel again. In recognition of the decisive role that trained K9 intervention played in preserving the lives and safety of every passenger on board, we propose the establishment of a new national guideline, one that formalizes the inclusion of K9-assisted family safety units in transit environments. We call it the Ravel Protocol. Darian's name echoed through the hall. followed by an invitation to approach the witness podium. He stood slowly, adjusting his blazer, and walked forward with Kieran by his side. Rocco followed at perfect heel. The room quieted again as Darian spoke. My job wasn't to attack or escalate. It was to observe, protect, and respond when necessary. Rocco didn't act out of aggression. He acted out of training, restraint, and trust. He paused. The system failed Merrick long before he stepped into that cabin. What we need now isn't more force. We need clarity, prevention, and accountability. Kieran, standing beside his father, looked up at the panel. His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He saved me because he knew I needed him. The silence that followed was absolute. Rocco, sensing the energy, sat squarely beside the boy, still, strong, loyal. The tribunal chair finally stood. In the end, he said, his voice steady with quiet reverence, order wasn't restored by protocol. It was restored by loyalty, courage, and truth. He reached for the officer's son and froze when the father stepped up and his K9 clamped down, turning the attacker's windpipe into evidence. If you believe real protection never hesitates, subscribe now, because justice knows exactly where to land. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, discrimination, and the moment accountability stops intimidation in its tracks. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about justice, equality, and protecting every passenger with dignity and respect.